Everyone, welcome to another episode of Dynasty Underdog. I'm your host, Brad Dawkins, with me tonight, Billy Beeman and Jake Core Bloom, also known as at Jake Abrams and at Willie Beeman FF. What's going on, guys?
Oh, not much, dude. Excited for the show. We got some Discord mailbag questions, along with another fire sheet produced by Jake. So, how you doing, Jake?
I'm doing well, guys. I transitioned to Blue Sky.
Oh, did you?
Just so everyone's
wondering
same
what
handle.
kind of transition happened there.
Yeah. Not to offend anybody, I've transitioned from Twitter or X to Blue Sky. I'm using both, but honestly, it's crazy. It's like going back like a few years on Twitter. It's kind of like a breath of not fresh air, for lack of better words. It's like it's like fucking deja vu to like Twitter from 2017, but it's kind of a vibe. It's interesting interacting with people in like a new space. But shout out to Tommy. The reason I wanted to say anything is because shout out to Tommy. He shouted me out right as I entered onto Blue Sky, and it was super nice. Got a bunch of followers and started to interact with people. So it's been a good vibe.
Yeah, I got the same. I got the same welcome from Tommy. I've gotten a bunch of followers. I have not interacted much on Blue Sky. It's like I don't know. I'm finding it hard to start over completely. But
same. It's really hard.
But, it's like nobody knows this account. Nobody knows. There's no history on here, so it's interesting. And I don't know. Whatever. I'm still over on Twitter.
Yeah,
I'm everywhere.
I couldn't do it. I got nothing against folks doing that or whatever. I personally can't. I spend too much time on Twitter as it is. Like, what am I gonna do? Like, the extra amount of time, like fucking go to Blue Sky? Like, am I doing that?
Yeah, exactly.
Split time.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's impossible.
Yeah. Social media snobs over here. Okay, it's my platform's Twitter. Okay, we sound so fucking stupid.
I don't have TikTok. I don't have Instagram. I have Facebook to stay in touch with my grandma, but other than that, man, Twitter for life. Sorry.
It is like Blue Sky is like Twitter adjacent though. It's like all the same conversations. It's like, am I gonna double my time on social media? So it's like you kind of do have to like make the ultimate flip. I feel like if you're gonna do it to actually like use one or the other. I don't know. It's but it's interesting. There are some people who are just have dipped out from Twitter. So we'll see what happens there.
All right. So Scott Fishbowl. This is. I mean, we haven't talked about it all year, but we're getting.
There's a reason for that, all right?
I was gonna say maybe we left it off the show sheet for a reason.
It is the worst. My worst team I've ever had. My worst team I've ever had. I mean, I won't. I'm not going to talk about it.
Started with 2 tight ends. I remember.
I did. I went Kelsey Laporta.
Oh, perfect.
It's safe to say that didn't work out very well for me. So
yeah.
I think Hollywood Brown was my wide receiver 1. I think Pacheco was like RB2 or something. It's been bad. So yeah, how have you guys done though?
Similarly unwell. I mean, I've been dealing with a lot of injuries this year, but I don't know. Like the first point here, key takeaways. How could we have done better? For me, like just looking at my roster, I definitely chased wide receiver too much. Is kind of where I think I failed a little bit. Like just kind of trying to zig where others were zagging. I still got a pretty good running back lineup all year, but I just feel like it wasn't enough, and there was probably a lot more points being consumed from running backs, as there are generally in fantasy this year, but also in the format where it's like point per carry and all that stuff. So I think I did a good job like streaming kickers or having enough kickers to stream. Tight ends were decent, but like it's just way overloaded on the wide receivers for me. And so I think it's more about not tailoring my draft specifically to the format, to the league settings, I should say. But what about you, Jay?
Yeah, no, I think that's completely fair. I also went Scott Fish toilet bowl up in here. Yep, that feels about right for all three of us. Yeah, I think for me, my biggest takeaways were really kind of stuck in really going away from running back. I feel like I'm just like so stuck in my ways of going hero or zero running back. And the funny thing is that I had guys like Chuba Hubbard, Ramondre, Jerome Ford. And if you look at my team's max PF, it was number 2 in my league.
That's crazy.
I think I finished. I think I'm in like 10th. I was winless in the first 7 or 8 weeks. Within the last 4 weeks, I've scored over 210 points per week. So needless to say, I think if I would have done better and understood my own lineup, I think I actually could have performed relatively well this year, which really pisses me off. But yeah, it's a live and learn experience. I just wanted to also say shout out to both of you, but specifically Raya, for shouting me out so much on Twitter. I think that's definitely how I got in. So thank you. It was definitely a fun experience. And the one thing that I would also say is I put a lot of emphasis at the beginning of the year into streaming returners. And I do think there's definitely a skill to that, especially because it was so lopsided in terms of scoring. And I definitely just faded it after probably like week 3 or 4 after I got fucked by Jalen Darden on Cleveland. Like it's a super random dude, but like I think he scored me like 30 points or 35 points in like the second week, and then he got cut. I think the third week, and I had him in as a starter, not knowing the dude got cut, and then he got signed again to the practice squad like the week after, and I was just like, I didn't realize how volatile the returners were, but it really did put a lot of perspective of just like making sure you're paying attention, and then also guys like an Austin Eckler, who had return upside potentially, like was scoring sometimes up to 35 to 40 points in a given week, even when he wasn't necessarily performing super well as a running back. And then when he was performing well as a running back, you had kind of like that double bonus going on. It was just kind of crazy how there were certain dudes that definitely really hit the nail on the head of how to kind of exploit the scoring system. So yeah, I think that those were my key takeaways of how I'd like to do better, but I know that the scoring will be different next year. And I think Scott has already kind of alluded to the fact that he kind of messed up with the return yard point system. It was a little too frisky.
Hey, also, put some respect on Jalen Darden, University, I think North Texas.
Oh, where's that based?
Yeah, he was a fantasy darling for sure.
I'm not a huge like film guy, obviously, you guys know, but he's kind of like. Oh shit! Tony. He's like Kadarius Toney, only with better hands.
Yeah,
I'm serious.
which and his career has gone similarly too.
Yeah, I was just saying, go watch.
Yeah, unfortunately, but yeah, Jalen Darden was a guy who we all liked in the film community for sure.
Wild.
Scoot.
Yeah, but yeah. Obviously, streaming returners. I think I abandoned it. Like Black Shear would get me like 45 and then like 0. And it's just like, I don't know who's keeping up with this. So it sucked. It was fun again to be in Scott Fishbowl. I'll say that. But like my team, absolutely horrible. Absolutely horrible.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Back to Dynasty. So where does Dynasty fall off from real life? Like philosophically, psychologically? So I guess, we're talking about maybe people losing interest in keeping up with Dynasty as opposed to the real life, or is this where you're trying to go with it?
No, so this was actually more of kind of like a thought experiment similar to that of just like the general NFL fan. I think like most general NFL fans love the idea of comparing fantasy to the NFL because they participate in both typically. And a lot of times we don't really understand the general dynamics of franchises as a whole. So ideas like tanking in Dynasty don't necessarily kind of cross over to the NFL. But when they do, the fan themselves are not necessarily 1-1 with the idea of tanking for a lot of different reasons. And so let's kind of almost start off with that bullet and the idea of tanking. Because like, I think it does have a pretty big psychological impact on an organization when there's just like moves that are made. For instance, the Giants, right? Like with the Giants cutting and releasing Daniel Jones, we all don't think that Daniel Jones is particularly good, but he's clearly the best quarterback in that quarterback room because Tommy DeVito is pretty terrible and Drew Lock is also pretty terrible. Well, I think we saw that this weekend as well. Yeah, I'm pretty positive.
Well, just an aside, did you know that Peyton Manning offered offered for Drew Lock to call him anything he needed, and Drew Lock never took that up until very late in his career.
That's
and
crazy.
And like even his dad would say that he never put in like the effort. So just an aside for Drew Lock.
No, it's
just
super
saying.
interesting. I think it shows. I just think he's a pretty lazy player to begin with. And he didn't put a lot of effort into training camp this year. We saw it in preseason. He looked pretty terrible. There's a reason why Tommy DeVito ended up actually getting selected over him to be the quarterback too.
Insane.
And that says a lot about him. But I think like more
can Tommy DeVito lip sync on the bench like Drew Lock can? No, he can't.
No.
Yeah.
Probably not nearly as well.
No, you're fine. And so I think like the biggest thing that we've seen is the Giants community is very down in the idea of we want the team to tank because that means that we can get potentially the highest QB in the upcoming draft, blah, blah, blah. But then when the team actually shows off a pretty terrible performance like they did the other day against Tampa, the entire fan base now wants Brian Daboll and Joe Shane to be fired because the idea of tanking now no longer seems appealing. So I thought this idea was really interesting because it doesn't have the same impact that it does on ourselves, right? Like I was saying this to Billy before the show, but my Justin Jefferson on my League of Legends team isn't conscientious of the fact that I am also intentionally starting Trey Benson as my RB1 right now, right? Like he has no idea of this, but does it impact, the way in which the rest of the league perceives my team and the way that it's interacting? And I think it does. And so I think the general, I guess, conversation I'd like to just bring up is like, who is impacted by the things in which occur within a dynasty lens versus an NFL lens? And I think it's just kind of an interesting conversation to dive into.
No, that's actually super interesting, especially, I mean, the tanking conversation is funny because the fans who are upset are the league mates in this comparison, right? Like your league mates often get all uppity about somebody in the league tanking purposely, right? Like, and whether it's dishing off their players and taking on a bunch of picks, like that's essentially what we had happen in the League of Legends that you mentioned, where somebody saw somebody stacking up a bunch of first round picks and is like, this is unfair. Somebody saw Jake stacking up a bunch of picks and was like, the league is becoming unbalanced, yada, 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 like coming up with excuses. And it's like, at the end of the day, I do think that it's one of those things similar to NFL fans where it's like, you want it until it doesn't work for you, or until you don't like how it feels, right? And like, if you were doing it, you probably wouldn't care as much, or if like you were the ones actually doing the tanking, like on the field, and like the players, if you're the players, you're not, or if you're the organization, you're not going to feel as bad because you know what you're trying to do. You're trying to get somewhere. But as the fans, you're trying to enjoy a product, or as a fantasy league mate, you're trying to enjoy the league and have it work best for you, right? And so I think the motivation often comes back to that when it really shouldn't. Like as a good league mate, I think you should just be, what's best for the league, which is, I guess, the same conversation as the fans too, right? Like, stop being all pissed off. Like, that's kind of where the conversation goes with the tanking thing, I think. But I mean, I think similarly to real life, I do think tanking kind of impacts outwardly in your fantasy leagues as well. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Uriah.
Yeah, just like this little bullet point here, like, obviously, Jake's going to speak from the Giants lens. I'm going to speak from a Cowboys lens, and we're both kind of going through the same thing. But like, the Cowboys went out there and they beat division rival with a much better record than Washington Redskins in pretty fun fashion. And from a fan point, when it comes to the NFL, like my brain's telling me like I want them to lose this game. But like the NFL fan to me enjoyed every fucking minute of that beatdown. Like, I want my team to win. I can't help it. I want them to win every single game. And that's hard for me in Dynasty. Like, I do want to do that too, but I feel like it's a lot easier for me to let go in Dynasty.
Yeah.
I have a couple of rebuilds where I'm like, this is sweet. Like, I don't even care what happens this week. Like, yeah, I'll sell that guy off. Give me that pick. Like, it's no big deal because you are essentially the player, the coach, the GM, everything but the commissioner in the league for your team in Dynasty, right? So you control all of that. You are the fan as well, right? Like, I love seeing my tanking team lose. That's amazing to me. Like, that is my fanhood when it comes to playing Dynasty. in that situation. It's the same with winning, right? And you have a contender. But the thing is, you get all these player interviews. I'm not trying to go too long, but you get player interviews from guys like CeeDee Lamb, Micah Parsons, all those guys that went out there and just balled out. The new guy that was like, bagging groceries a couple weeks ago, cornerback with like 3 pass breakups, a sack, and all that other stuff. Like, they're not tanking. They will never tank.
Right.
NFL players can't tank. Coaches, they can't tank. You tank, you might not have a job again. These guys are playing for contracts. These guys are undrafted free agents. They're practice squad guys who got called up because of injury. Do you think they give 2 shits about when Jerry Jones is going to select his next player in the upcoming draft to replace you? No, they don't fucking care. Like, they're going to go out there and try to win the game every single time. You might see in a regular season team, you might have a team that's like 8-0, but they might be down by 30 points. Maybe at that time you see some guys going out there like just running her out, trying to get it over with. This game's over, let's go. But when it comes down to it, especially this time of year when these young guys get a chance, like, none of them are tanking. It just doesn't exist. It's not the same thing like the NBA where if you tank and you get one big guy, now you have like one of the top 5 guys in all the league. That could change an NBA team. It doesn't change. A top 5 NFL player doesn't hardly change the entire roster. It's not going to change a team's outcome like the way it goes for the next 5 years. Like, there's just too many pieces. There's too many jobs on the line. So it's a whole lot different. That doesn't have a lot to do with dynasty. That's just like something that when people talk about, oh, I want my NFL team to tank, it's like there are too many mouths to feed. There's too many families out there relying on paychecks and these job security. It just doesn't happen.
No, I think it's a really good point.
Dynasty, but that's my rant.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly the crossover that I was looking for. And the only thing I'll add is that I do think that in their own right, GMs do tank. Funny enough,
sure.
I think that they make changes to their rosters in a way that kind of, for lack of better words, weaken their week-to-week lineup and put their team knowingly in a worse situation because it has positive, for lack of better words, positive consequences moving forward, right? Like, the interpretation by the outward-leaning person will think of it as negative, but in the long run, it's supposed to have some type of positive outcome. Now, I think like the way in which we see those changes occur, I think that they kind of go through really interesting waves and windows, and the way in which fans and other folks see it definitely have some pretty strong challenges with it. Just to Billy's point, within, a dynasty league perspective, someone's perception of, for instance, my team in League of Legends currently sitting there with, 5 or 6 startable players. After the next upcoming draft, I very well could sell off all 6 of my first round picks and have a very, very, very competitive team in that league and change the entire dynamic of the league. That realistically, to your point, Uriah, won't happen in the NFL. It's not going to happen overnight. The Giants could draft Shedeur Sanders or Cam Ward, and either one of them could be a top 10 quarterback in the NFL, and the team won't just turn into a top 5 team because of that singular performance. The other players have to be decent. So I think from that perspective, I completely agree. Now, from like a commercial performance perspective, we don't really have that. But we do have this thing where we, especially within the community, are quote unquote analysts or people within the community that have voices. And so the way in which we show off our portfolio to others, like, does that have an impact on the way that you kind of handle the way in which you manage your team? So for instance, let's say you have, 10 teams and 9 of them are quote unquote frauds on Dynasty Daddy sitting at 4-8 right now. Like, does that have a negative impact on your brand, on your image online? Or do you think no one gives a shit and you can just say whatever you want and people just care about your opinion?
Oh, I mean, I think nobody gives a shit anyway. You know what I mean? Like about like, especially about like your record, like anybody's record. I don't think anybody gives too much of a shit, like unless they're actually paying the specific person money and like they're expecting to get the return of like also winning leagues out of it. Like, then they might be interested in like, your record, so to speak. And like that, it's an interesting question because I certainly think for many people, especially like paid analysts, their results matter to them. You know what I mean? And it's going to impact how they play. I'd bet a lot of people who play like portfolio ditch off teams that aren't doing well and just start, picking up other ones or new ones or whatever, just to like not have the bad ones in their portfolio and have that record. Like just thinking of one example. But I mean, I think even for myself, it's definitely crossed my mind. Like, oh, how's it going to look if I'm like, especially last year, I think when I did the whole like ROI, not ROI thing, but the whole my like record thing across the season and across all my leagues, and it was good. But I was like, if this was bad, like how would I feel about it? Like I remember thinking about that, and I was like, you got to not care. Like so like it's also something I think that unless it's like very important to you for some reason, you probably shouldn't even be tracking it for that reason, if that makes sense. Like you should be tracking your records for different reasons and more league specific, I imagine, like across years. But overall, it's like it just shouldn't be something that's on your mind because it will impact how you play, like how you look to your league mates, your friends. Like in our home leagues, we all feel it. Like you don't want to be in last place. Nobody wants to be in last place with a bunch of your friends. You know what I mean? So like obviously winning would be better. And I do wonder though if it can get you in a spot like Jake's kind of alluding to, if you have a bunch of like fraud teams, if you try to push them towards competitive teams, harder than you should or would, and then end up in poor spots long term because you made moves you shouldn't have made. So I think that can happen by kind of focusing on what your record is and what its outward appearance is. But it's a real thing, no doubt about it in my mind. Your thoughts, Uriah?
Yeah, I would just quickly just I do see as like, okay, so as Jake was talking about an audience, or you guys have mentioned like what does that look like in Dynasty? Like I feel like the leagues like that we're in, the listener leagues, your Florida league a little bit, because I know these people and I interact with them. Most all of them are either in the Discord or we've come across somehow, like you guys, right? So if you guys see me making terrible moves or I make a trade, I think what it does is in the leagues where I am with nobody I really know or interact with like on a regular, I'm way more willing to like just like either not care about the results or make more moves more freely. I do feel like I'm more guarded in making moves in the DU leagues for that reason. Feel that. Like I don't want a team that's eliminated from the playoffs right now that I wasn't purposely tanking. Because I feel like, okay, then why are you even listening to me?
That's an indictment of me and like, my advice. Yeah.
Why would I take your advice? You're sitting at 6-5 or whatever the hell it's going to be, and you're trying to win this thing. Like, and you have no picks. Like, I don't know. So those things do give me hesitance on making moves in those leagues because I want to set a good example and put a good product out there.
Yeah. That makes it that, yeah, exactly. And that's why I'm asking this question, right? Because like that is in its own right commercial performance, right? Like you are your own brand. You are a brand of Dynasty Underdog. You want to ensure that the brand of Dynasty Underdog is respected. It's not a refutable action. It's like, look at my results. My results show that this is a legitimate thing that I am relatively good at. And therefore I have some type of, reason for you to actually spend your time, your 60 to 90 minutes a week to the words that I'm saying, right? Like you're not going to go out there.
Uriah's like, I ain't there for 90 minutes ever. Don't worry.
Yeah, fair. Depends on the week. Depends on the week. But yeah, I think you really, really closed off kind of where I wanted to bring that. And yeah, I don't have anything else to say, but I do think that there are a lot of crossovers that we don't really think about on a week-to-week basis, but we as fans of the same sport that we are participating in from like a gambling perspective need to have realistic expectations from both sides. And I think that's the biggest takeaway that I had. And I just really wanted to say thanks to both of you for diving into something that I think was really wild for us to kind of talk about. So thanks.
No, it's super unique. And I think that it kind of leans into some of the conversations we were having last week about like preparing to lose and whatnot, like managing your expectations and all that. But I totally want to just echo what Uriah said. Like, don't want to leave him out on the island at all. I feel the same way in the leagues where I'm much more purposeful and guarded with the moves I'm making And I've made some head-scratchingly bad moves in it, specifically DU2. DU1 even I've gotten my team into a rough spot. Granted, I won the league at one point, but either way, that's not how you want to do it. Like you want to put a better product out there, but also I do feel like it's an opportunity where we get to experiment a little bit with our listeners, you know what I mean? And put ourselves out there a little bit. So like, I do feel like if we fail or not, I mean, even if we fail, but slip up, whatever it is, like it's an opportunity. It's like it's an opportunity to learn something or to teach somebody something, you know what I mean? And use it as a lesson learned. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's always a way to use it and put a positive spin on it, but I totally agree with Uriah, being in those leagues, being a host of the show, it puts you in a different position where it's just a whole different set of factors that go into your evaluations. And that's something you need to kind of fight against sometimes, for sure, because it shouldn't really matter as much, but it does. And that's where the real world meets the fantasy world, I guess, to Jake's point. And so, yeah, I'll finish off there and we can move on.
Also, one more question for Jake. So on Dynasty Daddy, can you input anybody's sleeper handle and see their...
Yes. Yeah, you can input anyone's.
What do you think
handle.
this guy does?
Yeah. It's literally I spend probably close to 4 to 5 hours a week doing that. No joke.
Sweet. So with Twitter, I now have community note access. I'm just wondering if I could have some fun with this. Yeah. Anyway, go back to.
You definitely could. You definitely could.
All right. So next thing. Fantasy Witching Hour. Will wins become losses and losses become wins? And where are you and what are you doing with your team right now? Yeah. I think I'm next in line.
You've been practicing that?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, this really is the witching hour coming into our dynasty leagues. I think leagues that have trade deadlines are probably this week for the most part. I think I don't believe I'm in any with trade deadlines right now, but some teams like you have here. So some teams are simply just crawling into the playoffs, yet some managers are missing the mark with setting lineups across a variety of leagues. And that's true. We've seen it in DU leagues, seen it. I think League of Legends, there might have been one. I missed Console Wars 2 weeks ago. It didn't really matter. Like I literally had the minimum amount of available players to have a full roster by the time I realized it. But yeah, like what's your advice here? Like what are some reasons that people are missing out? Is it lack of interest? Is it just the grind is too long? Just maybe their teams aren't as interesting as they were to begin the year. What advice do you have? What do you think's causing it?
Yeah, I think it's definitely I think that there's a crossover for specifically redraft players who are playing maybe Dynasty for the first or second or maybe even third year, and they just aren't necessarily as excited by their own lack of interest or intent that they've put into the team, and it's almost showing now that the leagues are more extended. So teams in their own right, when they're not kind of interacted with enough, I think almost fade out, and you almost see them from just like an age perspective kind of fade out, but also from a talent perspective. Because if you're not properly maneuvering players within the right windows, I think you end up just sitting there with guys like a Jerry Jeudy or Elijah Moore are two really good examples of players who you probably could have gotten a first for when you probably drafted them after the startup and then never found that window ever again. Travis Etienne's probably another good example of a guy who just lost value so quickly and you weren't able to get off of him in the right windows. And I think like no matter how successful your rookie drafts are, if you're not properly interacting with your league mates throughout the year, you yourself probably will find yourself kind of detached from the league. And I think that's kind of what happens is like, if you're not sending out offers, you're not interacting with the offers that are coming in, you're more than likely going to just kind of let that team almost die, even if it's performing relatively well. And I have seen this. I play in 11 leagues in both redraft, keeper, and dynasty across. And I would say it only happens in dynasty, and it's happened in 3 of my 6 dynasty leagues so far over the last 2 weeks. So I really just wanted to call this out as kind of like a PSA / like, if this is something that's happening to you, like maybe try and solve your own, internal journey of like why this might be occurring, and maybe try and revitalize your own kind of experience. What are your thoughts, Billy?
Yeah, I've never purposely not set a lineup, or like, not, I guess you don't purposely not set your lineup, but I haven't ever become so disinterested. I haven't set my lineup for multiple weeks, or, it's only been either I was on vacation or literal forgetfulness of one league for some reason. You're out of contention and you were focusing on the other ones, and you thought that you set your lineup, but you didn't. Like, that's happened to me in console wars before, for sure. Happened to me, I think, when I was competing, even, where like I forgot and I'm like, oh shit, like what the hell, and whatever. But other than that, yeah, I like, there are no other explanations other than you are now out of contention and you're either disinterested or you're pissy and you're like, I'm not doing this anymore. But like, you got to, like, I feel like you have to. And it's not necessarily so much about like tanking. It's more about like unfortunately, it's about the competitive nature of the league, right? It's like you could potentially knock somebody down in the playoffs, out of a bye, or knock them out of the 6th spot, or whatever it is, off just a fluke win. But that's part of the game. That's like part of why teams play on Sundays. That's part of what we're doing here. So yeah, I mean, that said though, as a commissioner or even as a league mate, I'd never, unless I'm up against somebody, really ever notice that, or unless there's a matchup that I need somebody to do something in, then I'll notice. Like, if I'm looking at that matchup, oh shit, this person's not setting their lineups now. I mean, maybe this is kind of like Bush League or whatever, probably is. But if there's somebody up against me who's not starting players, I ain't saying shit. If there's somebody in a matchup that I need them to do something and they're not starting players, I'm gonna say something. And so, like, I'll take my dubs and I'll take my edges however they come, I guess. But yeah, so that's my thoughts on it. I don't know if that is the wrong way to approach it or not.
No, that's winning mentality.
There we go.
That's a winning mentality. Like, there's nothing wrong with that at all. It's not your job to let people know they don't have a full lineup, right? It's not your job to, just like if you're playing any game with anybody, it's not your job to like let somebody know they could do this to make themselves better or whatever. Like, you don't see a wide receivers telling defensive backs, hey, I'm running this route. Like, you know what I mean? Or like, hey, you're lined up in the wrong spot. Like, who gives a shit? Like, but you'll help your teammates out, which is helping yourself out in Dynasty. But I think what was saying about like the redraft thing, and then that might be true. We might be seeing it from newer Dynasty players who are more used to like redraft. But like, I feel like in redraft, like everybody's still kind of, is interested, right? I think maybe people who are playing Dynasty maybe have more leagues and it's easier for them to say, fuck it with this other one. But I think the big thing to realize, especially the new Dynasty players, if you're going to keep going, like, this is still your team next year. So do what you can right now to like not be in the position you're in right now, next year, this time. And now's the time to do it. So there's always something to do in Dynasty. Letting your team sit there idle is a bad choice. I've done it in multiple spots and it doesn't work out very well for yourself. So I think it's important to let people know that, hey, like, this is a different game than what you've been used to playing, and you're going to have to take these guys with you next year. That's it.
Yeah. No, I think you both brought up really good points. And I will say that this came from the idea of these teams in all 3 of the circumstances. All 3 teams are sitting there in somewhere in like the 5th or 6th seed spot, didn't set their lineups, potentially going to knock themselves out of playoff contention. That's
unbelievable.
That's what I'm referring to. So that's why, like, for me, I feel like when I said,
I don't know how that happens.
These folks are maybe caught up in redraft, is more so the idea of like, redraft is constantly churning out your team. So there's always that like new excitement every year. Whereas if you're not constantly like interacting with your team enough, it's going to feel redundant, right? Like, you're looking at, Travis Etienne from his rookie year to now year 3 or year 4, and you're like, well, he hasn't really improved all that much. That's kind of lame. Okay, it is what it is. But instead, if you're actually trying to move players like him I think that keeps you more engaged. It keeps your team more engaged, where like, even if you made like a crazy move earlier in the year of like, a second and Bucky Irving, you have someone new to be excited about, someone new to pay attention to. But if you're not constantly churning and you're only adding 3 or 4 new players a season, is there really all that much to really like look forward to? I don't know. And that's why I did want to bring it up, because I do think there is like some interesting psychology behind it that I obviously cannot relate to. As everyone learned last week, I unfortunately trade way too much in my leagues. And so I spend 4 to 5 hours scouring the internet and looking at other people's rosters and their trades and, the things that they're doing. So obviously I'm not the target audience of this. I'm just curious about like how this might occur. The other thing I will say is that I have spoken up. I did it in the DU league. And I wasn't trying to be an asshole. Like, I legitimately am just like shocked by that type of behavior. So in DU2, this happened with somebody, and I basically was just like, hey, is like everything okay? You're literally knocking yourself out of the playoffs. Like, that is nuts to me. Like, you're paying money every year to play this game. You're sitting there in the 5th or 6th seed. Like, wake the fuck up, dude. Like, it's not, it happens. I'm aware of it, but like also at the same time, I would never let that happen. Like, I'm just gonna be real.
Yeah, no,
like, I like legitimately would never let that happen.
Especially
and it's happened
if I'm in
multiple
contention.
times.
Like,
And
it's paid money.
It's happened multiple times
front.
with this dude this year. So it's just like, I don't know. I just don't get that type of mentality. And I do think it does impact the competitiveness in the league. So now, most likely, a shittier team, no offense to Billy's team, has like a great shot to get into the playoffs, right? Like that team has no right to be in the playoffs, but potentially will sneak in because he sets a legitimate roster every single week. 10 scrubs will still do better than 7 active players every single time, except on like the skew weeks where Saquon Barkley scores like 50 points or whatever. But anyway,
I have been decimated by injuries. Don't you talk down to my team like that. No, like I can't relate to these lazy bums who are in 5th or 6th spot not setting their lineup. Like it like that defies logic, defies everything to me, because like you paid a certain amount of money up front, and the only way that you really get the benefit of paying that money is either winning the league or being an active participant in the league throughout, right? Like, otherwise you literally just wasted your money. And then to like, I guess my point is that the season is so quick, and there's only one real goal that you get at the end, and you're just kicking yourself out of that by just not paying attention is crazy to me. So yeah, that's something that we can't let happen. The bottom half of the playoffs in DU2 looks rough. Yeah.
Yeah. It's not going to be that league is not going to be pretty for whoever gets in the 5th or 6th seed probably, but anything can happen.
Listen,
that's the craziest thing.
I've made it to the finals multiple times doing that. So, let me back in, please, let's see what happens. But
I would love that head-to-head matchup, and hopefully, knock on wood, the semifinals. So by all means, please, Billy, come in.
Yeah. Right. Get knocked out by a shitty team and see how you feel then.
I won't be there.
I won't be there.
I got on the other side of the fence like week 4. I did the right thing there.
I probably should have done
but
that.
Yeah, it was really smart.
Yeah.
You came in second last year, and you intentionally then went straight into rebuild because you're like, these 4 other teams are on steroids. Yeah.
I think I won the year before, so it's just a matter of the thing. You gotta shit or get off the pot, and it just is what it is.
Billy can't do either, so it's fine.
No, I'm constipated just sitting there. Yeah, it's brutal. But no, I do think this is a great conversation, and I do think that for the betterment of the league, you probably do need to speak up more often than not. It's just, especially with situations like that. I mean, it's going to be hard if you're the guy facing, or if you're like on the edge and need to get in the playoffs, and this guy's about to let you in. But at some level, you have to make it happen, because like it's also just not conducive to a good league. Like, having that happen, you need everybody, an active participant, as I said before. So, it's a good conversation.
Cool, cruising along here. So this is a good one. A lot of dynasty leagues, most of the dynasty leagues that Billy runs, the DU leagues and others. A lot of the seeding for who gets what rookie pick during the rookie draft will be based on who makes it into the playoffs, and then the final people eliminated from the playoffs will be based upon not their seeding. So you could have the worst record, but still not get the 101. It's kind of a way to allow people to tank without people getting all crunchy. And the things that matter the most with it is max point for and possible points. Some people may not be familiar with that. This podcast is definitely geared to trying to inform newer players of things as often as we possibly can. So those who are not familiar, let's just go over the definition of what max point for and possible points is. So max point for is just obviously what you have in your roster. You have your 10 players and they've played 10 weeks, let's say. And then after that 10 weeks, you have 1,500 points. That's the maximum amount of points for that you have. Those are points that you've actually scored. Now, on the flip hand, your possible points is going to include guys on your bench. So say you started, for whatever reason, you benched Saquon Barkley last week. But he scored you 50 points. You didn't want to win. You're trying to tank. You're trying to lose this week. You're trying to rebuild. But you're holding on to Saquon Barkley for whatever reason. Those 50 points are still going to be added to your possible point total. And at the end of the year, when the league is over, playoffs are done, and everything else goes, that possible point total is where you're going to be sorted at as far as your rookie standings for. So you could have all these studs on your bench every week and have a really, really terrible win-loss record. But for the integrity of the league and the way it works, I think best for everybody is to go by possible points, meaning we don't want to make strong teams who are tanking stronger. We want to make teams that are actually bad have better picks. Anything you guys want to add?
And yeah, just to clarify, I believe potential points and max points for are the same thing. They're just termed differently based on the platform. So MFL is going to have potential points and Sleeper is going to have max points for. You also described points for, which was the original one, which is just your points for. And your max points for and potential points are just going to be your starting lineup plus your bench, and in Sleeper also plus your taxi. But in MFL, not plus your taxi, which is really how it should be to fully get the best out of the taxi squad. But that said, I mean, I think that you're right. Everything you said is very true. Like, I think it is the best way to mitigate tanking per se, but really mitigate like not setting lineups. Like, nobody in their right mind wouldn't just set their best lineup because you're not benefiting by not setting your best lineup. You're not going to be a worse team. It's just not going to happen. So I think that's definitely the best way to handle it for that. But also I do think that's something we should make industry standard is having the final two spots that get into the playoffs also based off of this metric, max points for or potential points, because
I like it.
Often you will find lesser teams making it into that 5-6 spot based on luck or something, injury, whatever it is, throughout the season, where then you'll have, the 7th, maybe 8th, 9th best team will have, 200 more points and max points for, or even just their points for that matter, than those other teams. And that just doesn't always sit right with me. Like, it feels like, if you're good enough to stay in the top 4, all year long or get yourself in there, you're probably a pretty damn good team. 5th, 6th, a little bit tougher. And I think going by points makes a lot more sense. You'll also find that a lot of the times those teams, especially for the 6th spot, have very similar points for. So it's not even going to be that much different than their record. And it will be much more indicative of the actual power of that team throughout the league. And so, it makes so much more sense, in my opinion. I actually forgot that all the DU leagues and my own league, like all my leagues that I run, I forgot that this is, I'm like sweating trying to get into the 6th spot. And I'm like, oh, my points for are like 300 more than that guy. I'm good. But it's like, I forgot that that's what it was. But whenever I run into a league that's not like that, and then I realize ours are like that, I'm like, holy shit, this is so much better of a setup. Like, it should be like that everywhere. And so that's I'll get off my soapbox, but that's my rant for sure.
Yeah, I think you guys nailed it. The only other thing I'll say is, for those who are more comfortable with best ball, think of max PF and potential points as just your best ball score. So, just think of how best ball works. Your best team available on a week-to-week basis, and however many points that team can score is what your max PF or PP will be. And then your normal points for will be, your little PP. Your points for will be whatever you set your lineup as.
Awesome. That's good. Good rundown.
All right. So shout out to the Discord. We have
you made it to the mailbag, Uriah. You made
it. I think I'll be able to be here through at least one or two. So we made it to the mailbag. Shout out, guys.
Ain't no 90 minutes for Uriah today, I'll tell you that.
No,
go ahead.
I mean, it's great. Like, I mean, I feel bad for dipping out, but like, I have a reason for it.
We love you.
I
just
feel great knowing that I'm leaving behind two amazing podcasters.
There it is.
Super smart.
There it is.
And probably do a better job than I do. So I don't feel bad for leaving.
Stop.
The self depreciation. Okay.
Yeah, all right, let's get into it.
Let's get into it. So, shout out from Ben Wink. What's his Twitter?
At
B Winkler.
B Wink.
B Winkler. Yeah.
B Wink.
So he just has one simple question. He says, "Why does Jaden Reed want me to starve?"
I loved how he worded it. I had to keep it in there.
Yeah.
Look, real simple. So I mean, he's showing Jaden Reed's last few weeks: wide receiver 25, 74, 61, 17, 41, 59. This is like a good, as your wide receiver 3 or something in a league, like you could throw him in there and be like, okay, this works. But it's just kind of been,
might be disappointed.
Yeah, I mean, it was investing heavily in any of the Green Bay wide receivers is what it comes down to me. We talked about this all season last season. I mean, where's Dontavian Wicks, Romeo Doubs, Christian Watson, Jaden Reed? Like, Billy and I talked about this extensively last year, and just like, I never had a clear cut, this is my guy. I mean, except for rostership, I definitely have a ton of dubs, but that's just cost, not like planting my flag on any of these guys. I just thought there's way too many wide receivers, and nobody's ever stepped up as like the wide receiver 1 there, and they still haven't. Mm-hmm. So he wants you to starve. Like he doesn't want you to starve. He wants you to eat, but like there's just too many people to get the ball to there. And this is just what's going to happen week to week with any of those wide receivers, for as far as I can tell.
Yeah, and honestly, sorry, Jake. I'll be quick. I think the emergence of Tucker Kraft has also been a bit of a problem for somebody like Jaden Reed and all the wide receivers in general, because it's again another mouth to feed, but also somebody who eats in a similar way as these other guys. Like they feed similarly in the middle of the field, shorter area. Like Jaden Reed can be an absolute boom play at any given time, but he's not like a deep threat. Like that's not really the guy he is. Like they have Christian Watson for that, and we're seeing him be utilized that way. Doubs is kind of the go-to chain moving type guy. He's actually getting his still. The other ones are the ones who are suffering, and it seems to be it's either going to be one of these guys, and when I say that, it's going to be Reed, Wicks, or Kraft kind of thing. It's like one of those three is going to slot in with that third role right now, and there's not really a wide receiver 1 per se in this offense. There's just not, and that sucks. Maybe Reed will continue to develop, and maybe he'll become more of a target hog as his career goes on. But right now, like there's really no signs of that, and I don't think it's like he's doing anything wrong necessarily. I mean, I don't know. What do you think, Jake, in terms of like the film or anything like that? I don't think it's anything that stands out from that respect.
No, this goes back to actually a conversation that we were having. I want to say it was in the off season, or maybe it was early in season. And we were talking, I want to say specifically about Dontavian Wicks, and I brought this up, but Matt LaFleur has openly stated that he wants all of his wide receivers to be great. And I think you're seeing that. Like LaFleur is intentionally setting up his team so that it's borderline impossible for a defense to understand the different types of schemes and also skill sets of the individual wide receivers and how they'll be used. So like, for instance, most NFL coaches, because of the way that they tend to like typecast individual players. A Christian Watson will run basically like 2 to 3 routes. LaFleur says, fuck that. and Christian Watson's actual route tree is significantly more advanced, even though he's not necessarily good at all of those routes. That's a whole different conversation. The same thing is happening with Jayden Reed. And I think one of the most important things you can take away from this image that Ben had actually provided was his snap share, which is probably the most damning and the most significant piece of information for me. So over the last 6 weeks, starting from the furthest away, 53% snap share, 74, 59, 68, 57, and 50. Like, that's not a player that I want to start, regardless if I think he can, quote unquote, eat at that level. I know he can. I think he has individual, like, big play capabilities, especially as a player who basically has like a skinny man's Debo version of himself, where you can see carries out of the backfield, some individual screens that are supposed to be breaking out into larger plays, things like that. But I think the reality is that LaFleur has figured out a way for this team to be successful without there being like an isolated star player outside of Jordan Love and Josh Jacobs. And I think Josh Jacobs is actually the player who eats in the most. Jacobs, funny enough, has taken on a bigger receiving role than he ever has in his entire career here in Green Bay, and has taken away the need for the wide receiver screen, which was so popular coming into the season for Jayden Reed off of his rookie year. So if anything, if anyone wants to point fingers at anyone, I think it's probably Josh Jacobs, as crazy as it sounds. And he finally broke his touchdown drought several weeks ago after like 9 seasons in the NFL. And that's not that long, but after like 6 seasons in the NFL, he finally caught a receiving touchdown. And I think it really just goes to show that it's such a strong emphasis in this offense that you really just don't know what the fuck you're going to get. Like, you really don't know. It could be Tucker Kraft. It could be Dontavian Wicks 1 week. It could be Christian Watson another week. It could be Jayden Reed the next week. But like, do I want to, as a fantasy manager, take that risk? Absolutely not. And it's funny because at the beginning of the year, we looked back at some of the trades that we saw happen throughout the summer. I traded away Jayden Reed for a late first in Console Wars and a third. And honestly, I still feel really happy about that trade. Like, this is the type of asset that I don't want just because I can't control it. Like, I know I can't control any asset, but like, I can understand the range of outcomes a bit better. Jayden Reed is just such a crapshoot that it's just not worth my time.
Yeah, it's hard to make start-to-sit decisions consistently with that inconsistent of a portfolio. Anytime he's under 6 targets, you don't want that guy in your roster, and that's not a great place to be, especially when he's not getting that many targets very often.
All right, next one, and then I'll leave you guys to it. If you have secured a buy already, what would your moves or non-moves be in the coming weeks? Shout out to Poetry in Motion.
Yeah, this is I can hop in real quick. So if I've already secured a buy, I'd probably be looking around for like the hottest sellers and see if there is something that they're selling that I really don't want somebody else to have, but also may fit my build, right? Like, I don't want to do something for no reason or something stupid, but like, can I take something from somebody that is going to make a team a little bit better that I'm competing with? That's one thing I might do. The only other thing I think I would try to do, and this is a pretty specific situation, I think, but if my team is stacked enough, which if you got to buy, you might be, then I might look around to the other competitors, the other top 5-ish teams, and see if I can maybe move something that I don't want that they might think they need that's still on my roster for future draft capital. And like, I know that sounds counterintuitive, but if it's something you don't want, then you're not going to be that concerned about them utilizing it. But also it's an opportunity to get something done where they think, you're the mark in this situation by giving up something good, but also get something for the future in a position where you often can't get future capital because you're the leading contender. And so there just might be those opportunities to move stuff to other people who are desperate. And maybe these also can, the 7th, 8th seed can qualify too. Like, do they think they can get in, and do they need something? and could I get their draft capital that might be better than they expect? You know what I mean? That might be that 7th or 8th pick or whatever in the draft, or I'm sorry, better than that, and may end up a better position than that in the draft. So those are kind of the approaches I'd probably be taking if I was a team that had a bye and I wanted to find some way to like do something actionable. But yeah, what about you, Jake?
Well, not to put you on the spot, are there any players that you can think of that would be kind of like a good, like, roster edge player that you think you'd be able to sell for something like that?
Yeah, Jerry Jeudy, like who just caught like 6 of 6 or 6 of 7, has a couple weeks in a row where he's getting 6+ targets up near the double-digit range, and he's producing with them. The team doesn't look like it's going to stop performing the way it's performing. They have JMO throwing the ball. You could definitely sell that kind of thing to somebody, I think, who's on the fringe that needs, the wide receiver 3 to be a little bit more productive than the Jaden Reed or whatever, you know what I mean? That needs some more consistency. And maybe you can snag a 2nd plus or, whatever it is. I mean, you probably can't get a 1st for him. Maybe you can, but probably in like the 2nd plus range, and just move off of a guy you don't really need or want to play that game with,
Yeah, that's a good shout. I was thinking of 2 just off the top of my head. Someone like a Cooper Kupp or a Mike Evans. If I can somehow snag a 1st on somebody in those windows, I absolutely would. And in the other direction as well, Joe Mixon. I know everyone is high on the whole fact that running back ceilings and age cliffs are no longer a thing. Thanks, Derrick Henry. You can go fuck yourself. But I think like I don't want to mess around with that personally. And the same thing with Tony Pollard. I think Pollard has actually created a really awesome window for himself to be able to be sold relatively high, and maybe even Chuba Hubbard. So those are 3 guys I think you could probably sell relatively high on, where those windows didn't really exist throughout the majority of the season. And you're now looking at, getting into playoffs. If your team is properly defined well enough throughout the rest of your roster, those types of profiles shouldn't be that big of a loss. But if you are me and you're rocking like a hero running back situation, Joe Mixon probably is going to be hard to move, but just something to be mindful of. I just assume that no one else is as silly as I am when they're building rosters except for Billy. What about you, right?
Yeah, I was just thinking, so I like what Billy's saying, because as a contender, typically it's really hard to get future capital at this time, right? And you don't want to give it up. And then, if you do want to give it up, like it's you're either like, okay, if you've secured a buy, so it means like you're the top contender, right? But there's almost zero chance that normally you're going to get future capital any type of trades you're going to make, right? Unless you do what Billy was saying, like try to look for somebody that needs this small piece on my team that hasn't actually helped myself get to that team. And I think that's the point I'm trying to make, is that try not to get so cocky that you're like, hey, I'm balling, I don't need this player. You really want to make damn sure that this player hasn't really helped you get that far, and that does have some appeal to somebody else that they think will, right? So I was going to shout out Cortland Sutton, and I'm thinking Cortland Sutton might be one of the reasons like you're there. Chuba Hubbard actually might be one of the reasons you're there. Yes, this is a good time to move off those players if you're not contending. If you are contending, they might be part of the reason you're actually there. And so don't shoot yourself in the foot, is all I'm saying. Don't really know how else to say it, but like a lot of those times, like even like the players, who's the other one? Cordell Patterson 2 years ago. Like we had Dale and Console Wars, made it to the finals. Cordell Patterson was like a huge part of that whole thing. Nobody had seen that coming. He's a player that you couldn't get anything for the year before, but all of a sudden just blew up, right? Am I making this up? I'm making this up. Like he had
no, that happened.
Team. You want to go move off of Cordell Patterson, right? Like this is finally the sell window, but like you're sitting in the 2nd seed, and part of that reason is Cordell Patterson. Like you remove him from your team, like you're probably not as strong as you think you are. So you really do want to be careful about moving those players that maybe have a lesser name or a lesser value than they did before, and like this would be a good time to get the dynasty value, but like you're really still shooting for points. And so you want to kind of look at those players' points and see if they were as pivotal to get you to the point you are at right now, before making those moves, just because like, hey, now's a good time to sell.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that was awesome. And I did want to actually add an additional non-move. I do think that we, almost to Uriah's point, I think we really always look to like bolstering depth near this period of time. And I almost would kind of go towards the direction of like only spend when you need to in these moments, because you already know that people are going to overcharge you for their assets knowing your situation. So unless you can really get a solid deal, maybe someone like a Ramondre Stevenson who highly fluctuates in value week over week, but you need potentially like a running back 3 or something, like I wouldn't dive into someone who's going to cost too much just for the sake of having more depth, because that doesn't necessarily put you in a spot where you're going to look back and say to yourself, well, I spent up for instance, Joe Mixon. I sent my first. I know it's going to be the 112, and then you crash out in the semifinals, and you're sitting there now. The 109 is looking a little bit more enticing than a 28-year-old running back. Just ways that I try to look at it, so that you don't necessarily shoot yourself in the foot, for lack of better words, for trying to stack up your roster, but it doesn't actually get you points because they're just sitting there on your bench or something like that.
Well, we know that adding to your roster is only going to help you by very, very like under 1% most of the time, in terms of your success to win the league. So in terms of buying, I would never buy for depth specifically. I would only buy if we're like significantly improving a position, or if you had lost somebody as a top contender and you're like, I literally need to refill what I was getting here, and you can do that without giving up the craziest future capital, then like that makes a lot of sense, because like what got you there is no longer there. You need to actually replace that if you still want to have the same opportunity that you had or something similar. So like that's the way I would definitely approach it. But similarly, because adding is only going to give you that percentage chance, that extra percentage chance of winning. That's how I'm almost thinking of it the reverse way in terms of selling something off of my roster. It's like, how much percent am I, percent to win am I losing by getting rid of X player, as long as I have something, comparable to back it up, or, if I have enough depth, I'm like, all right, I can move on from. Granted, Cooper Kupp can have a boom game, whatever. He's obviously got the upside, but it's like, can I still get 12 to 15 points out of something else on my bench and move Cooper Kupp for a first? It's like, that's probably a better EV bet to make, right? In that situation where it's like long term, that's a way better value gain than the potential of him really taking me over the top in the championship round, where it's like, it obviously that's a, you have to balance that out. And it's definitely not the easiest thing to do, for sure. And that's why I, on the front end, said specifically, these are, certain situations where you have a stacked team. Like, I think you need to have a stacked team to be thinking about doing that at all. I don't think it should be fringe. You need to be having the buy 1 or 2, and like, you got loads of shit on your team to be playing with. Now is that, then it's a time where you can start setting yourself up even better for the future to continue that super team, is what you kind of want to be doing. So yeah, sorry for the lengthy explanation there.
All right. I know I spit in hot fire tonight, but I'm gonna go ahead.
You were.
Go ahead and let you guys finish. Thanks everyone for listening to me, and I'll see you guys next week.
Have a good one, Uriah.
Later, Uriah. Busy, brother. All right. Then there was 2.
And then
all right,
2.
I love the questions that came in from the Discord. These are all really good questions. I like this next one. This is something I was thinking about actually talking about a little bit more player specific. Awesome. But before we get into that, something else just crossed my mind. You said something about aging running backs, and that's literally a conversation I have written down. We were going to do it today, but there was just too much going on. That'll be a next week topic, but it's definitely one I want to have, because I think the psychology of the community has shifted a little bit in a way it might shouldn't, for the lack of a better way to say it.
Yes, it might shouldn't.
I know. I thought it's It's funny. Okay, so next mailbag question here from Dr. Spliz. Why do I have to say this? Dr. Spliz the butt licker. My God, our Discord is just mental. Okay. How do we, I can't even see Jake right now, and he's making me laugh. All right. How do we react to the tight end market in Dynasty? So much hope for the young guys before the season started, which inflated the price. But only 10 tight ends are averaging over 10 points per game, and only 3 of them are younger than 26 years old. So the young guys aren't stepping up to the plate. How do we react to the Dynasty tight end market? Jake, I'll let you hop in. What do you think?
Yeah, I do think that this is a prime example, without changing the subject, of just like the community overreacting to certain experiences. I do think that for certain profiles, including myself, I think we might have jumped the gun, given that they didn't necessarily fit the quote unquote athletic profile to continue to stabilize in the way that we wanted to. And I'm speaking specifically about Sam Laporta. I think that we really only have 2 to 3 young tight ends that fit kind of the profile that I would be looking for in terms of long-term dynasty value. One of them would be Brock Bowers. Second one would be Trey McBride. And the third one would probably still be Kyle Pitts. We're talking about highly athletic, almost like freak athletes who are capable of doing both roles as a tight end and doing it at a really, really high level. The fact is that guys like Sam Laporta will have incredibly great weeks. But I think just because of how that offense runs and how efficient it is, it's almost a similar conversation to that of the Green Bay Packers. When we're talking about the wide receiver room, it's something that doesn't really make sense to invest in as heavily as what the community wanted to do, as heavily as I did last offseason or this past offseason. And so I think it's really just about really understanding profile and not getting too caught up in kind of the early breakout, because what Billy, Uriah have talked about a lot in the past, and I've listened to as well, is that tight ends do tend to take time to mature. So there's a really wonderful window of like not being too caught up in the idea of wanting to kind of speed up the process. And so when we see someone perform at such a young age or so early in their career, we just expect them to be able to do that year over year over year. And I don't know if that's a completely fair expectation, given that some of these guys don't necessarily fit those profiles. What about you?
Yeah, it's interesting. So you're saying that Sam Laporta is specifically less athletic than the other guys mentioned?
I'm saying less athletic in terms of his like receiving chops. Yeah. I just don't think that he's A, as good of a route runner, and B, has the same athletic upside on like a man coverage situation as Trey, Brock, or Kyle Pitts. Yes. And I'll include and lump Dalton Kincaid into that as well, because he was part of that same, young tight end group that got a lot of hype coming into this offseason.
Yeah, definitely agree on the I typically agree with what you're saying in general in terms of Bowers, McBride, Pitts have that athletic profile that you want. I don't think that Kincaid and Co really had that. I think Sam Laporta is closer to it. I mean, definitely by the numbers he has it, I would say, but you're absolutely right that in terms of his pass catching and his route running ability, he's not quite there with those other guys. So I'll definitely say that. I also think something that we don't do in general well enough, but I think really, really impacts the tight end position, is focus on understanding scheme with these tight ends, right? Like, it's super important what scheme they're in and their situation and how they're going to be deployed, right? Like, we wanted to ignore Jamison Williams, and all that, but like they've been trying to add that kind of piece and use that piece to this team. They have these 2 running backs that are absolutely dynamic, one in which can really impact the game, the passing game, but they also use David Montgomery from that respect too. So it's like, where are the targets coming from for Laporta? And just the scheme they're running there, I think is something that we need to be focusing on. In general, it's something that we don't often look at and pay attention to. Like Jonnu Smith feels like a product of his environment, and his situation scheme. And I'm just thinking of things that we can identify in the future to be like, okay, this might not be the most beneficial situation for this tight end, right? And so, like, for me, I don't want to overreact necessarily, generally to the position, because I think it's been kind of a wonky year for the tight end. But you see your usual suspects like George Kittle doing his thing, TJ Hawkinson coming back right into it, doing his thing. He just hasn't been there all year. Obviously, Kelsey is much older, and we were going to see some of a decline. Mark Andrews, we talked about it over and over again, slow start from injuries and car crashes and all that stuff. But I think that's another one where you can point to, look, the scheme changed here. Things are going to change for this player a bit. He's still a dominant tight end. He's still, one of the best players on that team, but obviously they are going to be passing the ball more to wide receivers. That is what they are trying to do with this team. And so it is going to impact, for me as like the Mark Andrews, truther, that should have impacted how I was viewing him and, the buy low periods. And if I even wanted to get in on that, should I be selling some of my shares? Like identifying that and actually, because, and again, I'm saying like, we don't pay attention to it enough. Even me who's interested in it, like needs to pay attention more and put actual faith in like what we're saying and seeing, like, okay, this is real. They are not going to be the same player because of situation or because of the player they are, whatever it is. And so, yeah, I mean, I just think that's been a big part of it over the last couple of years is being better understanding like what these guys are doing and what the teams are trying to do as they deploy them. But I do think Jake brings up a great point in terms of the athletic profile we're looking for from these guys. It needs to be very specific. And Laporta does a good job in kind of looking like what we want, but not necessarily fulfilling or executing exactly the way we want him to. And we got that initial season also circumstantial. There was a lot of situational aspects to his success in year one. And, we definitely let that impact us in our year two evaluation, which we shouldn't have as much.
Can we stop for a second? Because I'm thinking of a player who's kind of in a similar situation and might kind of see the same drop off next year if everyone stays healthy. I'm looking to Tampa Bay, thinking of Cade Otton.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you think, because I find him to be similar-ish in terms of stature, physicality, prowess. Route running is worse for sure.
Okay, good.
Yeah, no. I definitely prefer Sam Laporta over probably like a good 75% of the tight ends in the NFL. But I do think that Cade Otton is almost overachieving to what he can do based off of the fact that Chris Godwin and Mike Evans were out. And almost to your point about Jonnu on the converse or inverse, whatever the antithesis to this conversation, we didn't see true Jonnu Smith until Tua was truly back healthy and the offense was actually moving in the right direction. So, which is funny because you and I, we've had this conversation earlier in the year. You actually started second guessing yourself because of some
I
trade
think about
offers
this conversation too often. You have no idea. Oh my God.
Some trade offers that had happened in a certain league. And I was pretty adamant of the fact that I still thought that you made the right decision, not trading away Jonnu for that package. And you're now sitting there pretty happy with Jonnu Smith, right? And I think the funny thing is, yes, Jonnu Smith is 29 years old, but moving on to a new team that is in a weird flux situation because of the quarterback health just didn't give us a proper window to understand how they would actually use him with, Tyler Huntley versus Tua, not the same conversation. And so I want to bring up those 2 points to be like, I think circumstance to almost what you were last defining is going to change a lot of the future scope of these players. Like Jonnu Smith, if he stays in Miami, expect him to continue to actually grow on this window and also expect him to continue to have negative impact on both Tyreek and Jalen Waddle. And then on the other side, if Mike Evans and Chris Godwin are both there next year healthy, don't expect Cade Otton to continue to perform. Check out his numbers for the first 6-7 weeks of the season. Yeah. That dude was borderline, tight end 15, tight end 17. If you look at his actual tight end numbers, he was actually higher because of how poor the rest of the NFL tight ends were doing. But if he continued to do that throughout the whole season, it's not going to end well for him in terms of statistical performance. I'm sure he'll be alive and well. I made that sound really. It's not going to end well for him.
I mean, look at his first game back, or for not his first game back. Look at Mike Evans' first game back with his team. Cade Otton goes from the prior weeks of 10, 11, 8 targets down to 3.
Yeah.
Like, they played the Giants. It was it wasn't, their best performance out there, but still, like, that's I think more indicative of what you can expect going forward into 25 than what we're seeing now based on situation, even though Cade Otton, both Jake and I agree, is a pretty solid tight end, pretty solid player. But also what I want to say about Jonnu, which is kind of just a side tangent, but I feel like it's worth saying, is his stint in New England really impacted his probably development, but his fantasy perception, right? Like, he went from, I believe it was Tennessee to them, right?
Yes.
That was where he, okay. So he had some decent year, I should say, in Tennessee, where, people got really excited about the upside, gets paid the crazy contract, goes to a place where they simply don't know how to use tight ends in this new day and age for whatever reason. And it was 1 year, I believe, with McDaniels, and then 1 year with a DC for his OC. Regardless, they just could not utilize him properly. And then he goes over to Atlanta, has a good stint there, and then over to the Dolphins. And it takes him, like Jake said, up until they get their quarterback back to actually, start performing and showing out. So I think just my point about him specifically is, like, the tools have always been there. And, like, the underlying success has actually been there. There's been one stint that I think really impacted how people view him and the perception of him as a player. He is the first tight end they have had that can kind of block. Like, he's not the best blocker ever, but he can do both things that they need him to do, block and catch the ball. And you're seeing that translate, to success, where McDaniels never used a tight end. He never fucking had one. And so I don't think Jonnu's the best tight end ever, but he is the best they have had, in a significant upgrade to what they had. And so, again, situationally, like, it just made sense here. And so that, getting back to the situation and the scheme, like, they use tight ends in the scheme when they have good tight ends. And that's what it comes down to. So I think we need to do a much better job of identifying scheme and understanding how it impacts the players on the field. Okay. We will move on. That was a great tight end conversation. Thank you, Buttlicker, for that one.
It's actually Buttlicker extraordinaire, to be fair.
Which is such a good name. Such a good name, dude. Mad respect. Okay. Laposaurus gives us our last one. Good friend of the show. Shout out Discord. Everybody hop in the Discord and join us, as long as you're not one of those betting bots. All right. Looking ahead to the offseason, what profile do players need to have in order to continue having a value bump in the offseason? The example I think of, that this is from the question. The example I think of is Kyle Pitts. He's young and he hit his rookie season. Every season after that, there was also hope that it would be his next breakout year. Anthony Richardson saw a similar bump this most recent offseason, even though he didn't hit due to only playing 3 games last year. Is he expected to see a gradual increase in value in the offseason, with people chasing the potential again? How can we find those players, or those kinds of players, to target now without falling into the trap of trying to buy discounted high draft capital players that haven't been producing? That's a big question.
It is
a lot going on there.
Lots of words.
Lots of words. Like, the last part, like, how can we find those kind of players to target without falling into the trap of trying to buy discounted high draft capital players that haven't been producing? Like, I feel like the kind of players that fit into this overall conversation anyway kind of have high draft capital and you're trying to buy them. So I don't know if we're trying to get away from that necessarily, but for, like, I'll just, if you don't mind me hopping in real quick, like, the way I took this in my brain, I guess, led me to thinking that, and going back to a player we kind of mentioned, but I feel like Tucker Kraft kind of does fit this conversation a little bit, where it's like he's having a productive season but not fully tapped, and can gain value based on simply the idea that he could develop, like he could just continue developing in this offense, right, over time. But it's like, is that something we should really be buying into? You know what I mean? Or at least that we should wait to happen to buy into, or do you just do it now and get ahead of that kind of, I guess, what's the word I'm using for? But it's kind of like a faux increase down the road, where then you can take advantage of that, whether you want to sell off or just you have gotten ahead of it, right? I'm thinking maybe like AD Mitchell could kind of fit this profile as well. One that you want to get ahead of because he just inherently is going to probably have a boost over the offseason. And then the last one that I thought of was Tank Bigsby, who could gain value, especially if they move on from an Etienne, like just don't want to pick up his 5th-year contract, whatever it is. Then Tank is going to have a significant increase, but also you could just get the narratives of he was the better back all season, this, that, you know what I mean? And so like there's a couple of different paths I think that these different players can take to get there, but those are the ones that that this question made me think of. And I don't know if I'm taking it the right way necessarily, but what do you think, Jake?
Yeah, no, I think you are. I think those are 3 really good shouts. I would say that it's probably someone like a JJ McCarthy, someone who
that one was one I thought of too.
Yeah, so someone who people are forgetting about just in general. They're not going to sign Sam Darnold to the contract that his performance is probably going to deserve because JJ is just a cheaper option. I think the offense hopefully will end the year healthy, and you'll have a full complement of JJ, Addison, and Hawkinson from the very onset. They'll be able to have a full training camp, preseason, etc. And then someone else that I was thinking about was, oh man, it dropped from my head. Oh, that's brutal. That's what happens when you get older. But yeah, I do like those three shouts that you had. And I do think that more often than not, you are going to tend to lean into higher draft capital players for the sake of the fact that the NFL is going to be more committed to those players. You saw that same window of opportunity with, and this was a large conversation in the Discord today, actually, shout out to the Discord again, Bryce Young. Like, we all knew that Bryce Young's best purchase window was going to be when he got benched, not because we didn't think that there was a chance of, a Trey Lance disaster, but because his price was so affordable that it just made sense to buy back into him given his pedigree, right? Like, same thing with JSN. Last offseason, he didn't actually get that spike because people were afraid of the fact that he would have a repetitive second season without understanding that, Shane Waldron truly is a cancer to so many offenses and impacts individual players. It potentially is going to produce DJ Moore's worst NFL season if he can't turn it around in, the final 6 weeks of the season. But it is tough without me just like looking at individual players like off the top of my head. And I'm not really looking at like KTC, and I probably could have prepped for this a little bit better. So I do apologize to you, Lapisaurus. But yeah, I do think that like JJ McCarthy, that type of window where if you can take advantage of an injury, where people are going to forget about the talent, maybe someone who's kind of trapped in a depth chart situation, to Billy's point with Tank Bigsby, Jonathan Brooks, if he doesn't actually play all that much for the rest of the season, I think is probably a really good shout. Michael Penix is probably not a bad shout. Someone who can kind of slide under the radar, and depending on what Atlanta does this year as a competitive team, might find a window to actually become the starter next year, regardless of Kirk Cousins' contract. And then who else? I guess that would probably be the 3 that I was thinking of. I was thinking of Penix before. I'm glad I remembered his name. But yeah, Jonathan Brooks, Penix, and JJ McCarthy.
Yeah, I think those are great shouts. Definitely. It's an interesting question, and one that I think has limited answers, to be honest, because there's not that many players that fit that specific value arc, and that you want to go after, because often they might not hit. Like a Pitts has been a disappointing asset, though he's finally picking it up this year. But I do think it's an interesting question, and one we should keep top of mind as we head out of each year and into the next one. Okay, awesome. So I think last thing we're going to knock out here before we sign off are some trades, and we're going to see if they held up over time. That's what we're doing here.
That's what we're doing here. Yeah. So this was an idea from Frank Bros in the Discord. I believe his Twitter handle is like at ISTAN. I don't want to.
Oh God, I see one in here that's mine and that I do not like.
ISTAN. Oh yeah, and that's intentional. I picked a trade from basically each of us. So I'm sad that Uriah dropped, but we all had either good trades, bad trades. They all aged in different directions. Some of the trades aren't even our own, but they're from DU3 and DU2 just because those are two leagues that I happen to be in, and they were really easy to pull for me. So yeah, let's start from the top.
All right, so this was September 4th. DU3. These are all 12-team Superflex PPR 0.5 tight end premium, so 1.5 for all their catches, and it's start 10. So again, September 4th, Olave plus Kincaid for Jamar Chase, Michael Mayer, Khalil Shakir, Conklin, and a late second. Whew, I would rather have Chase by a mile, whatever's on that side. I'd rather have by a mile. That's my analysis.
Yeah, this is one of those interesting trades because I think at the start of the season, September 4th was right before that Thursday night game. Yeah. I think a lot of people were kind of on the fence about a deal like this. Like I think Olave, advanced metric extraordinaire. I actually love Olave. I think he's a fantastic wide receiver. If he didn't have Derek Carr as his quarterback, he would have a significantly different trajectory in his career, aside from his unfortunate head injury issues. But yeah, this is one of those
included.
Yeah, those included do have to, for me at least, they do cause an impact on my own evaluation or own evaluation of players. But Olave plus Kincaid for basically Jamar Chase. And I guess a second, because at the time, and Khalil Shakir, I won't discount him going into the season. He was relatively hyped up, and actually, funny enough, I looked into the trade history, and these two guys, the two owners, had traded Khalil Shakir just prior to this trade, like a few months prior, for 2/3. So the guy who got Shakir back got 2/3 for him, and then got him back again in this deal, which is pretty crazy to think about. So he basically got Shakir for free. I think all in all, this trade didn't age particularly well over time, I guess is like my biggest takeaway. And I don't know if this is necessarily like, I guess my big takeaway from this truly is like, if you're going to sell elite assets like a Jamar Chase, like I'm looking to only receive elite assets back. I don't like the idea of even like breaking him down into two upper tier talents, and one of which I don't even believe in, which is really tough. Like I literally own 0 of Dalton Kincaid across my leagues, but that's just me. So like I don't want to harp on like a specific player. I know that the community was relatively high on Dalton Kincaid, so I get it. It's just I don't think that at any point Kincaid is or was a top 5 dynasty tight end, and nor should he have been valued at that point. And I think that's kind of like where we need to kind of stick out our own necks and be like that's not where it's worth it to give up, wide receiver 2, who's actually now on KTC wide receiver 1. So yeah, that's kind of my breakdown of this. What about you?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with you. I think that a lot of it hinges on the Kincaid thing, because whoever was buying that side is basically thinking to themselves, I'm getting an elite tight end plus a pretty solid wide receiver. And that's just not how I think that person should have been evaluating that trade. And it just like that Chase side is so juicy. I would take Chase over those two assets easily, like alone. You know what I mean? So it's like, to get a lot added on to that Chase side to get that done is just, it's wild. Again, when you have like that established elite asset, you can't, like for me, and it's what Jake is saying, like you can't be guessing with what you're getting back. You can't, get developmental back and be like, okay, he will be this. Like, it's like, you need to get that back plus usually, you know what I mean? Because the only reason you'd be trading Chase generally is to rebuild, in my opinion, and get extra back. So like, that's just not what was done here. And I get the thought too. I agree. I understand where Jake's coming from in terms of like what you think you were getting back at the time. This looked a lot better then, but
not to cut you off, it is important to note that at this exact time, Jamar had a possibility of sitting out. I think actually at the date of this trade, he was technically not practicing. So I'm just saying, I think that was some of the psychology behind the thought process. I just don't think that that's the best way to maneuver through these things myself. And that would be just my feedback to anyone who's feeling like stressed or overwhelmed that you have an asset that might sit out like a Le'Veon Bell. Like, the likelihood of that ever recurring is borderline 0%, because I think every other player and their agent saw how bad he botched that it ruined his entire career. And I don't think another player or their agent is going to allow that to happen, because the agent wants their player to have money and the player wants to have money. So I think that's my strongest takeaway.
Jamar Chase also is like in a whole different prime, like where he has so many years ahead of him. It's like, I don't give a shit if he's sitting out for half the year. Like, I'm not selling him low off of that. Like, unless I'm, again, getting back like Justin Jefferson. Like, if we're trading elite asset for elite asset so that, you know, you're not competing and I am, and then okay. Otherwise, like, no, thank you. Okay, next one here. January 8th. Is that January 8th?
It's January 8th, yeah. Right after Super Bowl. Like, right after your league Super Bowl, yeah.
That was far back. Okay. So again, so this is DU3 again. We have Waddle for Nico and a second. Whew, man, that one hurts so bad. And like, you know, what's funny is like, this is something I could see myself doing. I know whose trade this was, but it's definitely something I could have seen myself doing because I wasn't a Nico believer. And Waddle's a great asset. And so it's like, would I have done that? No, because I knew what the market was. So like, I wouldn't have to give a second on top of Nico to get it done. But I think more where this one takes me is like understanding that your evaluation isn't always the evaluation. Like, you're going to be wrong sometimes. And when both the market and the player are telling you, you know, you're wrong, like you don't move the opposite. When I say move the opposite way, like I don't mean you don't move Nico. Like, you could still move Nico if you don't believe in him, but it's like you don't give like an unnecessary discount. You know what I mean? Because you believe something. Like, you need to adjust a little bit. And like, for me, I do want to do a better job of like reevaluating and being like, okay, like, yeah, you had this valuation, maybe he wasn't, but like, he developed and he got better and he is now a different player and the community views him as a really great player. So you need to act accordingly. And like, I just don't feel like that's what happened here. I feel like it was just like, Waddle's great. He's better than Nico. He's a better player than Nico. He's a better prospect than Nico. Yeah, I can give a second on top of him to get a better player. And it's like that evaluation had a lot of pitfalls in it.
I'd also go out on a limb and say that this is a perfect example of where scheme is really important, and to see how an individual is schemed so perfectly into an offense. I think, unfortunately, what we've noticed over the last 2 seasons with Tyreek Hill in Miami, like, Waddle's performance, unfortunately, is completely capped by his own usage. And to then, what we didn't know what was going to happen, to then actually bring in a tight end that fits perfectly into that offense, only continue to devalue his own ability to perform at a high level. So there's just ways to kind of get out from your own, I guess, internal biases, regardless if you're a fan of the player or not, to not dive into this. Because I do think, regardless of what Billy and I thought of Nico Collins, even after his breakout year last year, I personally wouldn't have traded him away for this, just because of his, one, success, and two, the fact that we just knew how the offense worked around him and how he was kind of propagated up by that offense. There's no reason to kind of get off that talent for someone that we already saw doing the exact opposite trajectory. Like, there's no reason to assume that Waddle was just going to have a random third-year breakout, third year being third year in this offense with Tyreek. That just doesn't necessarily exist for any reason except for just us kind of using some hopium, right? Like, unless the hopium is like, Tyreek Hill is going to be bad because he's getting older. Like, I just don't think that that's the way that we should be thinking about it, personally.
Yeah, there's definitely a misevaluation with Nico. Like, again, I think I would have advised, like, yeah, like, you can do something like this, like moving Nico for Waddle. Like, I would have liked to think I would have said, hey, like, maybe less than a second. But even back then, maybe I would have been like, hey, like, this is okay. But just, having hindsight, as my friend right now. But no, I think it's a good, I think it's a good learning lesson of, okay, adjust your priors. Like, let's not just fall into the same thing in the future again, where there's a player that you don't love and you're giving discounts to the community, like for no reason. And also maybe believe that this player's getting better or is better than you thought, because that can happen too. And so, yeah, that's what hits me the most on this one. All right, let's move on. We have one from 520 here in DU2.
This is you, actually.
Yeah, I know.
Okay.
I remember this one. So this is Kittle plus a 26 second for Hawkinson plus a 25 fourth. And I still feel good about it. So Hawkinson looks good coming back from the injury, no doubt about it. But Kittle is exactly who we thought he was, and get a 26 second on top of it, which is probably going to be early mid. So, yeah, I mean, I like this one. I think that it aged okay. And I understand that Hawkinson still is probably the better asset overall in terms of tight end wise, with his youth and performance coming back from the injury. But I think Kittle is still going to have, enough longevity, and adding that second on kind of feels good. So I think nothing wrong with that for me.
Yeah, I included this actually because I thought this was a good process trade. This was actually one that I kind of
you were not a fan of.
Yeah, I poo-pooed.
I remember everything.
I definitely shit on it when it happened. And I do think that in general process is actually really solid here. I think on a week-to-week basis, you get basically same points, if not more, out of Kittle, plus you gain that early second. In this game, you're still playing in relatively small windows, so there's no reason to be so alarmed by the 3 to 4 year age gap between those two assets, especially at tight end. So I think this is really more so about who do I think is going to score more on a week-to-week basis. I think Kittle is, and he has shown that as well. And I thought that at the time, I just was, I think, more alarmed by the dynasty value. And I think that's how a lot of people think. So this is truly why I included it, is because I think this is actually a perfect example of great trade process for how to kind of keep your teams competitive, but also look out for your team in the future by making these trades that, you quote unquote lose on a calculator, but you technically are going to win over, a week-to-week performance basis, as well as a long-term basis, when that early to mid-second turns into potentially even another starting tight end, or in the 2026 class, you're talking about a relatively stacked wide receiver group again. It looks good.
Yeah, and what's funny is these guys are back-to-back in KTC dynasty rankings for tight end. So tight end 5 and 6, and Kittle right behind Hawkinson, which makes sense. And I think, with my team there, unfortunately, like, I think it did what it needed to do, that trade, in terms of if I wanted to stay competitive, it would have done that. My team got a little injured. It's not really coming through. I could probably move off Kittle for more than Hawkinson right now to contenders because of how much he's scoring, and get pretty good ROI back still, and look to the future even further. And that might be something I need to do here in the coming days, week or so.
I'm interested.
Yeah, we'll see what happens. I've had people coming after Mike Evans and George Kittle, and it's been way too low. Like, it's been like a single first for the two. I'm like, get the fuck out of here.
For both of them?
Yeah. I was like, stop. Like, I don't even want to have this conversation right now. Like, this.
Yeah.
Anyway,
this was a Uriah trade, by the way, this next one. So I feel bad not doing it with him, but
do we want to skip it, or do we want to go down there?
Let's just cover it. It'll be quick, because I do think it's another good process trade.
All right, let's shit on Uriah real quick here. No, I'm kidding. I don't even remember what side he got of this. So this is January 13th, DU2, same league. Diggs plus Chubb for the 24, 112, 212, and a 25 third. Right, this was early in the year, so it was before the draft. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So Diggs and Chubb for the 112 212 and a third. This actually turned out to be fine. Like, and even if Diggs was healthy, I think it would have been fine for both ways, to be honest. But I don't know if you're getting that much more for Diggs and Chubb anyway. Like a first and a second round pick. Like, I mean, I've been super low on Chubb, and obviously he just had a pretty solid performance. But in my opinion, he doesn't look great. That said, like, I don't hate the process on this. I guess that's what I'll say. What do you think, Jake?
Yeah, I don't hate the process at all on this. This turned out to be Jonathan Brooks, Jalen Wright, and a 25 third. I think I think in general, this actually looks pretty decent for Uriah. Mainly because he was coming off of a contending year. He thought he was going to, I think, make a bigger push in the playoffs than he ended up doing. I think got knocked out maybe first round, and then ended up being able to solidify in that rookie draft. JJ McCarthy, Xavier Legette, who I have choice words for, Audric Estime, and Dylan Lobby, plus Jonathan Brooks and Jalen Wright. So I think, given where his team was at and reading kind of the writing on the wall for those players and their windows, I don't really hate that move. It's unfortunate that Jonathan Brooks, has basically had to take his rookie year off and probably will continue to do so. But given what that window might look like going into next year, it could improve significantly, and this trade might look even better. But I think the general process, without thinking about the actual draft picks, I think is pretty solid. You're talking about a 31-year-old Diggs, 28-year-old Chubb coming off of that horror injury, getting a first, second, and a third off of it feels like something I'd be pretty happy with.
Yeah, I agree.
All right.
Okay, God damn it. Another one of mine. I think this is the only other one of mine that's on here. And Jake did me a solid of giving me a good one before the bad one. But yeah, man, DU2, I can't seem to get out of my own way most of the time. So this is January 4th, again, going way back, right after the Super Bowl. And we signed off. Sorry, we're not going to have this conversation. No, I'm kidding. So I moved Saquon and a fourth for Pickens and a third. And yeah, it is not great. I mean, it's not the worst. Like, it's pretty bad, but it's not the worst. I feel like Pickens is still a pretty valuable asset. That said, this is a conversation I want to have next week in terms, like, I think it goes along with the same conversation of like aging running backs and stuff. But I think getting ahead of myself a little bit on moving the aging running back, but not getting enough back. Like this, I hate when I do this too, in terms of like buying an asset that I don't fully believe in, but believe the hype will get there. This is almost like a Nico Collins thing. It's like, can he get to those heights? And like, then I can sell him off, and then who cares, right? It's all good. It's all gravy. But there was no, and I think I wanted to say this was before the Saquon moved to Philly.
Yes.
So, this is also one of those things where you're like, the situation's not going to change. Saquon's who he is. He's with the Giants. They suck. He's going to continue to be mid, continue to deal with these injuries. He's already, 26 going on 27. Like, the decline's going to start. Let me just get out now. And it's like, it's a lot of nonsense. You know what I mean? Like, a ton of nonsense. And obviously the age cliff is real. The age cliff also has extended a little bit further than it used to, like where players can seemingly play a little bit longer at the running back position than they used to. But also, I just feel like when you have a player like Saquon Barkley, who is from a perception standpoint such a highly valued player, I should probably be getting more back anyway, and maybe being patient. And so that's kind of my takeaway from the person who actually made the trade. But what is your evaluation, Jake, looking back?
Yeah, I think looking back, you hit the nail on the head at the very end of that. For me, it's like the perceived value of Saquon is at like an astronomical level because of it goes back to his initial draft capital, right? You're talking about a second overall pick in the NFL draft when he was a rookie. going into a relatively bad Giants team who basically carried the Giants in multiple seasons to a wild card playoff appearance, to just different states of being, all because of how good he is. And that's always been kind of the media portrayal of him as well. So I think NFL media is really important when we think of fantasy assets too, which is why I think George Pickens is as loved as he is. It's a really funny trade when you think about it, because I think both players to their own right are very talented, but were kind of ceilinged. I think Saquon's the perfect example of when you're looking at contract situations in Dynasty to kind of be patient, to understand where a player might land before you are willing to kind of just get rid of them, even if they might kind of fall into windows of you wanting to sell them. And yeah, I think once he signed for Philly, it was just like the most prime situation for any high-end running back, considering that they were using basically schlubs for the past 4 years and we're still performing at a relatively high level. If DeAndre Swift is looking like a top 15 running back, I can only imagine what Saquon Barkley is going to look like in that offense. And guess what? We're seeing it right now. It's basically a top 2 running back in the NFL. So yeah, it's unfortunate for Billy, but I do like the train of thought. I just think it was a little too quick to the trigger. I think post free agency is actually when this trade should be happening. And if he fell into the hands of, I don't know, he could have fallen into the hands of even like the Ravens, and that would have been a great situation for him too. Like I just think like the market was just too fluid for us to be this quick on, and I guess that's my biggest takeaway.
Well, very premature, and also just the timing of it. It's January. We have so much fucking time. Why am I making this trade then? Like, why am I not holding the running back through free agency and making sure that he's where he was, or things aren't going to change? So I think this is a really good process to look back like this, because then you also realize the windows in which you trade in sometimes, and you're like, why am I doing that? Like, I can just be patient and just wait. And so, not everything is like that. Obviously, some deals may only be able to get done at one time or the other, but like these are situations, these kind of players you need to be more patient with for sure that are on your roster. And watch those windows where you're trading and ask yourself, do I need to do this right now? Like, or do I have time to like see what's happening? And that's something that I'm going to take away with me after that conversation. Okay. July 22nd, 24, DU2, Mixon, and a 25 fourth for Cup. I remember this going down. I remember talking to Jake about this. I believe this is his, and I'm pretty sure I was on the Cup side. I still, I think going back, I would have still said the same thing. And I think the idea was, running backs, who needs them? And Cup is going to have similar, if not more upside, was kind of the idea, which I think still kind of holds true. But Mixon is obviously, beat the case here and has been pretty good. So, yeah, I don't know. What's your takeaway from this one?
Yeah, I think my takeaway was I think I moved too laterally in terms of asset type. And if I wanted to kind of like stay in this range,
old.
I don't think I actually improved my team in any particular way. Instead, I just really moved laterally. What I should be doing is trying to kind of fall into even an asset that I think could kind of mature in the right direction. We're going to talk about him next, but I think I could have probably done something like this for maybe JSN in the offseason. That would have been something that I think I'd look a lot happier with doing moving forward. So that's kind of my biggest process, I guess, critique for myself. But I have been happy with Cooper Kupp when he's playing. I would have been happy with Joe Mixon when he would be playing. So at the end of the day, this really does feel like a wash trade. I do feel like I lost a fourth for no reason, but that's okay. And that's, that's what I'm losing. That's fine. Anyway.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like when you're moving one of these older players who you're kind of betting on declining. It's like you don't want to take on another one that you can bet is going to decline as well sometime soon. You know what I mean? So it's like, not, again, I didn't say that back then either, but it's a good one to look back on and be like, does this even make sense to really do, or should I be gaining more dynasty value necessarily, when you're making that kind of or you're trying to get rid of that kind of asset, let's say.
And one last thing, and to that point, I do think that we always talk about this, but who they're attached to. Like, I know Matt Stafford isn't on the verge of retiring, but he is later in his career versus that Houston offense. We know that they signed a relatively long-ish term contract with Joe Mixon. I think it's a 3-year deal. It just didn't really make sense knowing all that information going into the trade and then saying to myself, I want the guy who's attached to the older organization, the team that isn't set up for the future. And he's also the same profile in terms of age and everything else, right? Like, it just didn't make as much sense. And I looking back at it, I'm just like, I definitely could improve on the way I'm looking at these individual trades instead of just seeing it as, oh, I'm going from a running back that's old to a wide receiver that's old. And I think the window might be a little bit wider.
Definitely. Great stuff. All right. One more here before we get out of here. This was September 10th, 24. So just a couple months ago. DU2, 27 first plus 26 second early plus Dontavian Wicks for JSN, Will Levis, and a 25 third. Yeah. I mean, this one's JSN pretty much going away at this point. Man, I don't remember this trade specifically, I don't feel like, but I remember either this one or something similar to it where I was just like, that seems kind of like a free Will Levis, and like we shouldn't be moving him for that cheap. And that's how I feel about this one right now, but also in general, just moving those 27 picks, adding those 27 picks for a guy like JSN. Not the worst thing, I guess, ever, but man, looks like a cheap deal right now for the JSN manager. That's kind of how I feel about it.
Yeah, that's fair. This is actually a trade that I did in DU2, probably one of the only positive ones I've done in like the last 2 years. But the reason I brought this up is this is kind of the same critique I had live. I think I overreacted, and I think I paid too much for things that I didn't need per se. So this was a situation where Jordan Love had gotten injured week 1 in Mexico. I think that's where it was. And I was traveling abroad, and I just didn't know the extent of the injury at the time. And I sent out this trade almost immediately after hearing that his season was basically going to be over. He ended up not obviously having that extreme of an injury. I think the initial trade out was just a first for JSN. Actually, funny enough. And I got told like, no, don't like that. And I was like, okay, sounds good. So I sent a follow-up of JSN, Levis, and a third for the first and the second, knowing that the second was that owner's second. And he was like, no, that's still too little. Like, I want Wicks. And I was like, okay, that's fine. Like, I know that I am perceived as a Wicks lover, but I also know that situation been pretty strong to get out of that wide receiver room. I was like, okay, that's cool. And that's how we came to the trade. I don't think I thought that JSN was going to see this revitalization so quickly, but I've always believed in the talent. I feel like I sit here on my old man rocking chair every 5 weeks being like, trust in JSN. I swear he's gonna hit. And finally this season I do feel vindicated. But the one piece of this that I think was really off-putting was Will Levis. And I think this just goes to show about like quarterback value as a whole is like, even if Will Levis didn't hit, right, to Billy's point, in this type of trade, I am almost acquiring him at free. And so like, if I can even make out at selling him back as a second, I feel like I'm actually like gaining a profit here. So the general trade as a whole is definitely great. I just think I need to work on how I'm packaging trades to make it make sense in the moment, because this isn't a quarterback that I've ever felt high on. Even when he had his relatively positive window last year, I was banging on about how terrible he looked. I didn't think that he was a proper NFL quarterback. Didn't think he was game ready. And I still felt that way earlier into the season too. So I don't really know what changed to the point that I felt so, for lack of better words, desperate to add this quarterback per se. But I will say that the asset has improved. I think since his shoulder injury, he does look significantly better. He obviously still has a lot of the same issues. His interceptions that he throws are just complete brain dead interceptions. Some of the fumbles that he has given up are also just absolutely insane. But all this to go back into the process, I think make sure that you're acquiring assets that you actually want. And if it means that you necessarily can win a trade in the short term, just make sure that the long-term value makes sense. And in this situation, it did. I got very lucky.
Happened too.
Yeah. I got really lucky. There's other situations where it won't, and you'll, get on to, I don't know, is a good example. A Zach Wilson, for instance, or someone like that, and you're stuck and you don't know what to do with them. So yeah, that's my takeaway. But all in all, this was honestly a lot of fun. So shout out to Frank Bros for, kind of coming up with this idea of going into the locker, the hurt locker, the archive of all of our trades that we've had in at least DU2 and DU3.
Davy Jones locker. Yeah, this is a great exercise. I really appreciate doing this, and I appreciate you going back and digging through for some of these older trades, because I really do think looking back and seeing the windows in which these happened is really, really illuminating, and allows us to have an even deeper conversation about, why the trade was done, when it was done, if it should have been done during that time, and how we can improve on our process. So this was a really, really, really good exercise that I think we should probably lock in and do maybe every year. Honestly, look back and find a couple trades from January forward, and I mean we could go deeper, but definitely that would give us some food for thought. So with that, Jake and I have gone another 2 hours. We love yapping on and giving y'all something that you can digest over a long period of time. Thanks for Uriah for being here for at least half the show today. That was good. He definitely cut out before things got crazy in here. But that said, thank you everybody that participates in the Discord. You obviously helped make a ton of the content that is this show, so we really appreciate you. Anybody who's the listener and not a Discord member yet, get in there. You can reach out to me on Twitter, on Blue Sky, wherever you want. I'm there at Willie Beeman FF, at Uriah Dawkins, at Jake Abrams, at Dynasty Underdog. You can find us all over the place. Thank you, everybody. That's this week's show. We will catch you next time. Peace out.